Okay, so I'll be reading starting from chapter 4 of The Battle of Adwa by Raymond Jonas. Okay. The Price of Liberty. Addis Ababa was abuzz with news of the emperor's imminent return from a war of conquest. Menelik had defeated the Walaita people, and on the 18th of January 1895 would be a day of splendor in the capital. In fact, the emperor had arrived on the outskirts of the capital the day before. He might well have descended from the heights directly into his capital, were it not the eve of Tagmat, the Epiphany festival. To have entered Addis in celebration on a day of fasting would have been more than bad form. It would have been interpreted as a bad sign, an evil portent. Entry on the day of Tagmat suggested a convergence of the sacred and the profane, the splendor of Tagmat enhanced by the splendor of victory. Crowds lined the road as a ceremonial entry began. Presidents put clergy at the head of the procession. Their solemn demeanor clashed with the rainbow colors of their parasols and vestments. They murmured prayers as they bore the tabot, a replica of the Ark of the Covenant, wrapped in colored fabric. As the clergy passed, the fervor of Tagmat gave way to the joy of triumph. Some 30 mounted drummers and trumpeters led the way, followed by light cavalry, astride mules adorned with rich fabrics of bright colors and fine decorative stitchery. The emperor's party composed the heart of the procession. Menelik's Afenagus, part attorney general, part Supreme Court justice, led his pages, then Menelik himself, surrounded by his commanders, arrayed in embroidered silk. Horns of brass and wood let out a noise that blended bleats and moans, soon to be drowned out by celebratory gunfire. Cries of joy rose from the women at the first glimpse of the husbands, sons, and brothers who had been on campaign since November. As in the triumphs of ancient Rome, the event was an occasion for mutual admiration. The victorious ruler and his soldiers displayed all they had gained by triumph of arms. The people could, in turn, bask in the glory of such a vivid display of their collective superiority. Vivid it was. The Walaita are a pastoral people, and Menelik's loot included thousands of herds of cattle. Next came the captives, at least 15,000 of them, eyes downcast except for furtive attempts to glimpse the joyous crowd lining the route. They would be enslaved and distributed as compensation to the troops, part of the yield of the expedition. So extensive was the booty that the 3 days passed before the parade of soldiers and captives ended. The grandest trophy of all was Tona, the Walaita king. He had his people in a brilliant but desperate war of resistance. He had the wounds to prove it. He had healed sufficiently to participate in the grand and tragic procession. His presence proved that Menelik's triumph had been total. It also served as an object lesson. This was a king brought low by his failure to protect his people, the most fundamental of sovereign compacts. Once in Addis, Tona's ordeal continued. The king of the Muslim Walaita followed through on his promise to convert to Christianity. Then he sat unsmiling for a photo portrait. He was dressed as a king for the occasion, His white silk tunic and black silk cape were gathered high around his neck and fastened just below his chin. He wrapped his head in a pair of scarves in the manner of Menelik himself, except that he wore them pulled low in front over his brow. The scarves served as a platform for a beaded and scalloped crown that sat atop his head. He wore an indecipherable expression on his face. Tona would soon return home. Menelik might have simply placed one of his lieutenants on Tona's throne, but he thought better of it. The Walaita country occupied a vast and rich area, more than 1,100 square miles. It was also densely populated. Menelik claimed that there were more inhabitants in the Walaita lands than in the entire area between Addis Ababa and Massawa. No wonder that it made such a tempting target. Tona had been fearless opponent, but he knew he had been defeated. Menelik reckoned it would be easier to leave Tona in place and tap him from time to time for tribute than to try to extract a surplus from his people by brute force. Serving as Menelik's agent, Tona would funnel his people's wealth to Addis in the form of regular payments. However successful as a military campaign and a harvest of resources, the war against the Walaita was a disaster in terms of Menelik's global reputation. For someone who had acquired such a sure grasp of the role of public opinion, it was an uncharacteristic blunder. Perhaps Menelik thought that an intra-African war would be of little interest to Europe. Perhaps he never believed that Europeans would care about the Muslim victims of Christian might. He certainly misunderstood the intentions of Jean-Gaston van der Heim, the French company agent whose dispatches to Europe during the campaign were catastrophic for Menelik's image. Menelik had no one to blame but himself that such a capable witness as van der Heim shadowed him on campaign. Van der Heim came to Ethiopia in the early 1890s, hoping to drum up business for French exporters. By the summer of 1894, he had become a fixture in town and at court. When planning for the Walaita campaign got underway in earnest, Menelik began to work on van der Heim, hoping he would join the campaign. He provided van der Heim with a modest entourage of 12 men, 2 boys and 2 women, and Menelik fed van der Heim's penchant for gadgets, allowing him to filch a compass and barometer from the royal treasury so that he could log the campaign's progress. With his notebooks and a compact express detective camera built by the renowned Parisian photographer Paul Nadar, van der Heim could fancy himself a one-man journalistic team. In the run-up to the fall campaign of 1894 and in the after-the-fact justifications, Menelik presented the war as a kind of crusade and a long postponed payback. In the 17th century, Ahmad bin Ibrahim al-Ghazi had been the scourge of Walaita Christians, who had prudently converted to Islam. Ethiopian Christian lore was full of improbable feats performed against Muslim oppressors and wily rescues defying impossible odds. In the end, the Muslim Walaita were represented paradoxically both as a plausible, if unlikely, threat and as a conquered people ripe for religious reconversion. The emphasis should lie on plausible. The Walaita, least of all under Tona, were hardly prepared to threaten Menelik of Shoa and his burgeoning Ethiopian empire. When Menelik announced his campaign, he had already amassed East Africa's largest and best-armed fighting force. In size, the Shoan army easily surpassed that of Emperor Johannes on the eve of his death. Menelik could effortlessly field a force of 80,000, and thanks to the Italians and French, as well as independent arms merchants, most of them would carry Weatherly and gas bolt action rifles into action. Against such a force, the Walaita were hardly a menace. Despite the overwhelming odds, the campaign began in a fit of anxiety, where some signs, unspecified but numerous ominous auguries, drove Taitu to implore Menelik to call off his campaign. She besieged Menelik's advisors to do the same. Taitu's appeals continued until the empress fell ill, sick with worry. Menelik took the opportunity to leave, promising to return in a few weeks. Menelik's campaign against the Walaita. It was mid-November, the end of the rainy season, before Menelik's campaign got underway. Menelik assigned the role of advance guard to Ras Mikael and his troops. Mikael was a convert to Christianity from Islam, although it is unclear whether he was chosen out of concern for Muslim sensibilities as a test of Mikael's own conversion or as a portent of what awaited the Walaita once conquered. At least half of Mikael's force of 7,000 men carried good rifles of recent manufacture with which to take on Tona's defenders. Once Mikael's men had moved out, the imperial party followed with another 13,000 to 18,000 men. It was a forest of lances and rifles and tent poles. Each ras had every chief, however modest, had his entourage and his fighting men. Chief followed Ras, and Ras followed Menelik. The baggage train consisted of donkeys and mules loaded with supplies, as well as women who carried butter, berbere, honey, and other provisions. As Menelik's army moved south, the campaign began with spectacular violence, even before combat began. Pressed by the need to feed his vast army, Menelik ordered the dynamiting of a river, sending dozens of stunned fish floating to the surface. Providential fishes, if not loaves. Although the emperor had promised Taitu a swift campaign, it was mid-December before the capital received any word from him. The campaign had bogged down. Part of the delay was due to unrealistic expectations. The Walaita, it was said, lived an idyllic, almost biblical existence on rich red loam, and Menelik had expected little resistance from a people known for farming, not fighting. But the greater credit goes to Walaita leadership. King Tona had done what any defender facing overwhelming force would do. He organized a guerrilla campaign. When Menelik's forces arrived in Walaita territory, Menelik called on Tona to surrender on behalf of his people. Quote, "Do not exterminate your people," unquote, Menelik said, according to the Ethiopian chronicle of his reign. Quote, "Do not lose your country. Submit and bring me tribute," unquote. Tona would have none of Menelik's bluster. Quote, "Christians will never enter my country," unquote, he said to have responded. Quote, "I will not submit. I am ready to fight," unquote. Resistance started with a system of traps along the invasion route. At choke points, Walaita fighters set sharpened stakes in camouflaged holes. The traps injured horses and men and slowed the Ethiopian advance. Menelik and his men halted to fill the traps laid for them, also to fell trees, level roads, and construct fords. This was public works with military intent. As Tona and his men retreated in the face of the Ethiopian advance, they avoided defeat but left the population vulnerable. Menelik's army countered with classic anti-guerrilla tactics, targeting a civilian population presumed to support the resistance. Soon the inhabitants of the villages vanished, too, for fear of reprisals. Ras Mikael ordered his men to set fire to abandoned Walaita settlements and their characteristics beehive huts. Other villages threw themselves upon Menelik's mercy. They surrendered to the approaching Ethiopian forces en masse, carrying tree branches in a sign of capitulation. Raids and defections produced informants who were induced to provide intelligence and to serve as guides. These ultimately led to Tona. Once Tona's position had been established, Menelik's forces moved to prevent his escape. Leaving behind supplies and camp followers, Ethiopian forces undertook a night march along parallel routes to the east and west of Dona's camp, in a massive strategy of envelopment. After 6 hours, Menelik's men had pushed as far as Lake Abaya, nearly 200 miles south of Addis, behind Dona's position. They were ready to close the trap. Deprived of a path of retreat, Dona and his men could no longer avoid a pitched battle. Ethiopian numbers and firepower could do their work. On 11 December, Dona's forces squared off against Ethiopian marksmen arrayed around artillery commanded by the eunuch Balcha. In peacetime, Balcha served as one of Menelik's key administrative lieutenants, entrusted with control of the imperial treasury. In war, Balcha applied his accounting skills to the ammunition and personnel of the imperial artillery. Although the Italians later would make much of the idea of a eunuch serving as a head of artillery, his impotence, a metaphor for the reputedly limp Ethiopian gunnery, Balcha's guns spread havoc and confusion in Dona's army. Dona's men crouched behind leafy kabas trees. When they left protective cover to launch their spears, they were cut down by Ethiopian rifle fire, falling to multiple wounds. Dona was captured on the 13th, but the fighting continued for several days, eventually shading into a pacification operation. By 18th of December, the fighting was over. Brought before Menelik, Dona adopted a contrite tone. Quote, "I listened only to my pride," he moaned. Quote, "I should have submitted to you rather than see my country devastated and my subjects massacred. May the death of my countrymen be upon me." Unquote. It was a generous statement. Dona was shouldering responsibility for Walaita suffering, although the cruelty and rapaciousness of the campaign shocked even veteran Ethiopian soldiers, men who had participated in earlier campaigns in Harar and Kaffa. The brutality of the conquest was heightened in part by the frustration of Ras Mikael's men and the casualties they suffered, thanks to the effectiveness of Walaita guerrilla tactics. The conquerors had little mercy on Walaita men they captured and had to be restrained by Menelik. The Ethiopian Chronicle of Menelik's reign, occasionally given to boasting, relates that the Walaita were exterminated in a single day. While manifestly this was not true, Menelik hoped to rely on tribute from the Walaita for years to come. Menelik tallied 80,000 Walaita killed or taken prisoner. The official Ethiopian Chronicle puts the number higher at an improbably precise 118,987. Van der Heim thought the true figure much lower. What is certain is that, in Africa as in Europe, war feeds on war. Wealth wasn't just incidental to the campaign, it is what drove it. Ethiopian soldiers were compensated in the form of what they could herd, prod, or haul away. Van der Heim detailed the booty amassed in a day of raiding: chickens, cabbage, pumpkins, horses, donkeys, goats, cattle. The day's take included women and children too. Thousands were enslaved. A livestock epidemic beginning in 1888 had depleted not just Ethiopian livestock, but the Ethiopian population. The loss of population in Showa was devastating, as high as 1/3. Thus, there was a, quote, rape of the Sabines, unquote, dimension to the Walaita campaign, as Menelik and his army forcibly transferred population as well as wealth in the aftermath of victory. Menelik had his pick of the bounty of war. Of the 36,000 cattle seized, Menelik took half, sharing the remainder with his soldiers. Menelik took 1 in 10 slaves, for a total of 1,800 which puts the number of enslaved at 18,000. Menelik tagged his share with the sign of a cross, burned in acid on the hand. Thus indelibly claimed for the emperor, they were free to mingle during the slow procession back to Addis. On December 29th, still days from the capital, Menelik's forces staged a victory parade. A makeshift review stand was built. Menelik, dressed in a ceremonial finery, took his place on the platform beneath a sunshade of woven branches. His head was framed by lion's mane headdress. King Tona and his conquered Walaita chiefs sat in front of Menelik as the emperor cavalry paraded in review. The cavalry passed at a gallop, followed by running infantry. Before departing for Addis, Menelik left his mark on the land, ordering that a residence be constructed on a hilltop. It offered a territorial view of the conquered region. The view from abroad. Menelik's Walaita campaign was a resounding military success. It raised money desperately needed for the defense of Ethiopia. It allowed Menelik to test his army in real military action on the eve of the confrontation with Italy. The conquest of the Walaita turned green recruits into combat veterans. It also allowed him to try out his weapons in combat. Menelik had bought 15,000 grass rifles from the French businessman Leon Chauffenot. A surprising number of them jammed after firing 6 or 7 rounds, sometimes with fatal consequences. The jammed bolt-action rifles left Ethiopian soldiers temporarily disarmed as they struggled to drive the bolt home. Walaita fighters fell upon them with their older but more reliable technology of lance and sword. But the campaign had been costly in other ways. In the European press, Vanderheim's chronicle of the pitiless campaign threatened to undo Menelik's carefully cultivated image as a wise, humane, and Christian African leader. In fact, it threatened to erode Menelik's high moral ground in the looming battle with Italy by exposing an indigenous African impulse to conquer. Vanderheim's accounts of Walaita families being apportioned among Menelik's men also gave the lie to Menelik's public stand against the slave trade. Or more precisely, it exposed a peculiar casuistry whereby the ban on slavery did not extend to spoils of war, domestic servants, or Muslims. Menelik learned of Vanderheim's article and their devastating impact on Europe after his triumphant return to Addis Ababa. Menelik mobilized Casimir Mondon Vidhelhet, whose breezy defense appeared in Lotum in April. Mondon pitched the story of the Walaita conquest in historical and religious terms. The Walaita country was, quote, a former province of the Ethiopian Empire, unquote. Thus, it was not a conquest, but a reconquest of a province lost for several centuries. Moreover, the Walaita remained of Christian tradition, although strongly touched by Islam. Menelik had merely brought them back to the bosom of Christendom. Today the cross has won out over the crescent, he concluded. The former provinces returned to the Christian fold thanks to Remington and grass rifles. Force has submitted to force, so it was written. As for European public opinion, Mondon spoke for Menelik here, too, invoking a common Christian bond. European public opinion matters a great deal to Emperor Menelik. He expects a feeling of justice, a sentiment he regards as dominant among Christian people. While Mondon carried out damage control, Menelik let it be known that Vanderheim was no longer welcome at court. Vanderheim quickly packed his bags and announced he was leaving for Harar, where he hoped to pass a few weeks, perhaps to rehabilitate himself, and eventually return to court. Menelik played the gracious host, but he prepared a trap. He provided Vanderheim with a letter of introduction to Mekonnen, governor of Harar. Normally, such a gesture guaranteed a warm reception and accommodations worthy of a guest of the emperor, but Vanderheim learned via back channels that the court had sent a messenger ahead with special instructions for Mekonnen. By way of friends at court, Vanderheim learned that, quote, unpleasant surprises awaited him at Harar. Vanderheim organized his departure, including an armed escort. Once en route to Harar, Vanderheim announced a sudden need to deliver an important letter. He would forego his visits to Mekonnen and head straight to the coast. He offered his escorts double pay if they accompanied him. They bypassed Harar and made straight for Djibouti.